All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going right into the center of Venezuelan politics. We're going to be talking about what's been going on since their 2024 presidential election and really all the tension that's been building in the country. So the main thing we're looking at for this deep dive is this article from Infobay. It's an Argentinian online newspaper. And this article came out pretty recently on December 18th, 2024. The title is María Corina Machado llamó a estar atentos y concentrados ante las próximas señales que definirán el futuro de Venezuela, which basically means María Corina Machado calls for people to be attentive and focused on the coming signals that will define the future of Venezuela. I mean, reading this article, you really get the feeling of a country that's kind of holding its breath. You know, there's this election that nobody agrees on. People are calling for these massive protests. And there's this huge constitutional deadline coming up fast. And then you have María Corina Machado, who's like a major player in the Venezuelan opposition. And she's sending out this message telling people to be ready to act, be ready for what's next. So to help us really break down what's happening and what it all means, I've got our expert in geopolitics with us. They're here to help us sort through this whole tangled mess.
Yeah, happy to be here. And yeah, things in Venezuela are definitely something to watch, especially given all the political upheaval they've had in the past.
Okay, so let's start with the election back on July 28th. The article says that this opposition candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia, was declared the winner. But things haven't exactly been peaceful since then. What went down?
Well, it's the election results that have become the big sticking point. So González Urrutia might have been declared the winner, but Nicolas Maduro, who's been in charge since 2013, he's not having it. He hasn't accepted the results at all, and he's still holding on to power.
So you basically have two people saying they're the legit president, and the whole country's in this weird state of limbo. And that's where María Corina Machado comes into the picture. The article quotes her saying, and I'm quoting here, "I want to ask you to be ready to do what is necessary when the time comes." What do you make of that statement?
Well, it's interesting, right? It's definitely carefully worded. She's urging people to take action, but she's not saying exactly what that action should be. It keeps the government guessing, but it also keeps the opposition engaged. Like, they need to stay ready. It's this classic tactic to keep the pressure on the people in power without showing your hand.
It's like they're playing this high-stakes game of chess.
Oh.
Every move is calculated because the consequences could be huge. What kind of consequences are we talking about here?
Well, that's the tricky part, you see. She needs to keep the opposition movement going, keep people hopeful.
Right.
But if she comes out and says, do this or do that, especially if it sounds like it could lead to violence or unrest, well, that could really backfire. It could give Maduro's government the excuse they need to crack down even harder.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And then that puts people at even greater risk. It's this really delicate balance to strike.
So you've got this situation that's already really volatile, and then Machado comes in with this call to action, and it's like everything just gets ramped up even more. It makes you wonder what it's like for everyday Venezuelans, right? What are they going through in the middle of all this?
Well, it's important to remember that Venezuela has been dealing with this really serious economic crisis for years now.
Right, right.
A lot of Venezuelans, they're facing crazy inflation, not enough food, and it's hard for them to even get basic necessities. It's just this really tough reality for a lot of people. And unfortunately, all this political instability just makes things even harder for them.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. Their lives are so directly impacted by the decisions their leaders are making. In that context, Machado's call to action seems even more important, right? What are some of the ways that different groups in Venezuela might interpret what she's saying?
That's a great question. When she says doing what is necessary, that could mean a whole lot of different things to different people. For some, it might mean peaceful protests, civil disobedience. But for others, it might mean something more drastic.
Like what?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but this ambiguity, it could be a way to unite all these different opposition groups under one idea, you know? But it's also risky, because without a clear plan, all that frustration could explode. And that could lead to actions that nobody intended. Things could get out of hand.
Okay, and then there's this big protest that's planned for December 1st. The article calls it an enormous protest. What can we expect to see happen at this demonstration?
Well, the opposition is organizing this protest to push for a fair election and to bring back democracy to Venezuela. But there's this real worry about how Maduro's government is going to react.
Yeah, the article points out that the government has a history of responding to protests with violence. It even mentions that over 2,400 people have been arrested in past demonstrations, and they were accused of violence and vandalism.
Yeah, those numbers are pretty alarming. And honestly, it's probably an underestimate. It seems like they're using these labels, violent or vandals, to justify what they're doing.
Mm.
So for all that history, there's definitely a tense atmosphere surrounding this upcoming protest.
For sure. And on top of all of that, there's this deadline coming up really fast, January 10th. That's the day when, according to the Venezuelan constitution, a new government should be taking office.
Exactly. And that deadline is a huge point of conflict. The opposition is really counting on that date being honored.
Right.
It gives their protests and demands more weight,
Yeah.
But with Maduro refusing to step down, it's really unclear what's actually going to happen on January 10th.
It sounds like there's a lot riding on that date. I'm curious, what are some of the things that could happen if Maduro does try to hang on to power past January 10th?
Well, things could escalate pretty dramatically. I mean, we could see even bigger protests, maybe even a general strike. There's a chance the opposition might try to form what's called a parallel government, basically to directly challenge Maduro's authority. And then, of course, there's the question of the military.
Right.
Their role in all of this is huge.
Yeah.
The article mentions that they're currently backing Maduro.
Okay.
But could that change? That's the big question.
Yeah.
That's the big question.
It makes you think, like, if the military keeps supporting Maduro, it seems almost impossible for the opposition to actually get him out of power. But what if the military isn't all on the same page? What if some of them start to question whether Maduro is really the legitimate leader?
That's the wild card in all of this, for sure. The military's loyalty is everything. If they start to have second thoughts, even just a little bit, well, that could completely flip the balance of power in Venezuela.
So the future of Venezuela might actually depend on what a few military leaders decide to do. What kinds of things might influence their decision?
It's a bunch of different factors all mixed together. Obviously, their own political beliefs matter.
Right.
But also how they see the economic situation. And maybe most importantly, what they think the Venezuelan people want.
Mm.
If they sense that public opinion is turning strongly against Maduro, that could give them the push they need to act.
It's like a reminder that even when it seems like all the power is at the top, the people can still make a difference.
Absolutely. And in Venezuela, we've seen how powerful the people can be when they come together to protest, to demand change. Even when they're being repressed, they haven't given up hope.
And that brings up something else. Machado seems to be really counting on international pressure to help make sure the Venezuelan people get the change they want. The article even mentions that it's using information from EFE, which is a Spanish international news agency. So that shows how much attention this situation is getting globally. How do you think that international pressure might play out?
It's a key part of her strategy, no doubt.
Yeah.
By putting this situation in the global spotlight and appealing to the international community, she's hoping to use that pressure against Maduro's regime.
I see.
Some countries, like the United States, they've already put sanctions on Maduro's government and said they support the opposition.
Right.
But then you have countries like Russia and China who are still backing Maduro. It's just another layer of complication on top of an already volatile situation.
So it's not just an internal struggle for Venezuela. It's become this stage for all these bigger geopolitical power plays. How might these international alliances affect what happens in Venezuela?
It's hard to say for certain, but however this crisis ends up, it's going to have ripple effects across the region and maybe even further. It really highlights how interconnected all these political events are. What happens in one country, especially a country like Venezuela with all its resources and geopolitical importance, it rarely stays contained. There's always this web of economic, social, and international factors in play.
It's a good reminder that even though we're focusing on one country, the situation is part of a much bigger picture. So, shifting gears a little bit, the article doesn't really get into the economic side of this political standoff, but I imagine it's having a pretty devastating impact.
Yeah, you're right. The economic consequences are huge. Political instability and all this uncertainty, they're never good for an economy that's already struggling. Businesses are afraid to invest, foreign investors get spooked,
Right.
and all the economic hardship that's already there, it just gets magnified. It creates this cycle that's really tough to break out of.
Machado talks about a new beginning for Venezuela, which sounds hopeful and all, but do we have any idea what a post-Maduro Venezuela would actually look like? Like, what are the opposition's plans for rebuilding the nation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
They've been really critical of Maduro's policies, but they haven't really given us many details about their own plans for governing.
Interesting.
I mean, their focus has been on getting Maduro out, which makes sense,
Yeah.
given how urgent the situation is. But not having a clear plan for the future is a bit worrying.
So even if they do manage to remove Maduro from power, it's not like all the problems just magically disappear. What are some of the biggest challenges they'll be facing?
Well, trying to rebuild a country after years of economic mismanagement and political chaos is a massive task. They'll need strong leadership, but also unity, a willingness to compromise, and a shared vision for the future. All of those things can be really hard to achieve, especially in a country that's been so divided.
Which leads to another big question. What are the chances of actually seeing lasting positive change in Venezuela?
It's tough to say. There are so many players involved, both inside and outside the country, all pushing for their own interests. It depends on so many things. How strong and unified the opposition is, whether the government is willing to negotiate or give up power, how much pressure the international community puts on them, and of course the resilience and determination of the Venezuelan people themselves.
It sounds like there are a lot of possibilities, but no easy answers. And with that January 10th deadline looming, it adds this whole other level of urgency. It's like a ticking time bomb, pushing everyone towards this critical moment.
Exactly. That deadline is super significant. The opposition has been very smart to focus on it. It gives them a clear goal, and it puts pressure on Maduro. He has to either defy the Constitution or find some way to make his continued rule seem legitimate, like a showdown with everything hanging in the balance.
It really does feel like a showdown, but the article doesn't really talk about what happens if January 10th comes and goes and Maduro's still in power. What do you think we might see happen then?
That's the big unknown, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole situation so tense. It's very possible that we see things escalate even further, maybe even bigger protests, a general strike, who knows?
Yeah.
There's also a chance the opposition might try to set up a parallel government, basically directly challenging Maduro's authority. And then there's the military, of course. We can't forget about them.
Yeah, you mentioned a parallel government. What would that even look like? Like, in reality, how could that even work in a country where the current government just refuses to leave?
It'd be a really bold move, that's for sure. And it would definitely up the ante, no question. Basically, the opposition would set up their own government structures, and they'd say, we are the real representatives of the Venezuelan people.
Okay.
They'd try to operate right alongside, or maybe even directly against, Maduro's government. It would be a direct challenge to his authority. And it would be really interesting to see how the international community would react.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already super complicated situation. And it makes you think, like, what does true leadership look like in a time like this? What qualities does a leader need to guide a nation through this kind of turmoil?
That's a question people have been asking for centuries. It's not just about being strategic and making the right political moves. It's about giving people hope, uniting a divided population, and showing them a path towards a better future. It takes courage, compassion, and a deep understanding of the people you're leading and what they want.
And maybe a little luck wouldn't hurt either.
Maybe a little luck, yeah. And definitely a whole lot of resilience. The challenges facing Venezuela are immense. But we've seen time and time again how resilient people can be. Their ability to keep going even when things seem impossible, it's amazing.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always hope.
Well, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive, I have to say. It's clear that the story of Venezuela is still being written. And there are bound to be many twists and turns along the way.
It's definitely a story worth watching, and it has huge implications, not just for Venezuela, but for the whole region and maybe even the world. We've talked about political strategies, the upcoming constitutional deadline, the role of international pressure, but at the end of the day, it's the Venezuelan people who will decide their own fate. What do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to remember as they follow this story?
I think it's crucial to remember that behind all the politics and all the geopolitical stuff, there are real people whose lives are being deeply affected by these events. It's easy to get caught up in all the analysis, but we should never forget the human cost of political instability and conflict.
That's a really important reminder, and a good note to end on, I think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the heart of Venezuelan politics. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.